Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight. My name's Will Best. I'm the museum manager here at the Champaign County History Museum. Normally, I'd be introducing a speaker for tonight. That being said, I'm not doing any introducing other than introducing myself. I'm the manager there. I'm actually just about to approach my 1-year anniversary of being employed there as the museum manager. That being said, the story of how all of this research kind of began goes a little bit further than that. I started volunteering with them in January of 2023, assisting my predecessor Connor Munson in a few research-related projects and some collections work. And as a part of that, Connor wanted me to look into a little bit more about this small community called Myra, and to learn a little bit more about the station there and about a tall tale that he had heard in passing from his time here in the area about a woman who was hit and killed at that station. And, well, I started to look into it a little bit, and I opened a can of worms that just seemed to be a bit never-ending. That being said, at the very least, the research that I've been able to conduct and put together for all of you today, I'm very proud to present. That being said, I do also have all of this information available on the museum's website in 2 museum blog posts that you can go online and read. It goes into a little bit more detail than what we'll go into today, just so I don't keep you here all night. That being said, we will have time at the end of the presentation to answer a few questions. So at the very least, if you do have anything, you are more than welcome to interrupt or hold them to the end, whatever you'd like to do. That being said, before we get started, really, I couldn't have done this without a couple of local community members that were invaluable in being able to bring this research together. Mike Pinnell, Charlene Works, the Swearingen family, Travis Lotion, Neil Silver, and Jim Prather all provided me with information, photographs, and documents that I was able to utilize for my research and really help kind of put this whole story together. Otherwise, before we begin, there are a few things that I do want to cover. The first being that there's been some odd misspellings of Myra over the course of its history. The true spelling of Myra has always been spelled with a Y. That being said, as we'll get into a little bit later, the railroad fudged up when they built their line up through the area, and it's been misspelled M-I-R-A a number of times over the course of its history. That being said, at the very least, whenever we're referring to either Myra Silver or Myra Station, at the very least, we'll always be using the M-Y-R-A, except for one occasion, which was a weird instance that we'll cover later. That being said, the only other thing that made this a little bit more confusing that I don't want to cover now is there were at least 2 Myra Silvers that were living at the same time in Champaign County in the mid to late 1800s. We'll be primarily talking about Myra Silver the first. There was another Myra Silver who was the daughter of one of Myra's siblings who passed away in childbirth in the late 1890s. And so at the very least, I will point that out when we kind of get to that in the story, but at the very least, if you're ever looking this up online and you encounter a Myra Silver who dies before 1903, that's Myra Silver Love. That being said, as we begin our story, the first thing we want to cover is the patriarch of the family, the first Silver, David Silver. He was born in New Jersey in 1798 in New Jersey and would eventually move with his family out west. They would initially settle in Pennsylvania for a short period of time before continuing their way southwest, and they would eventually end up in Ohio. They would briefly stop in Warren County, Ohio, before eventually settling permanently in Springsboro, Ohio. Later, they would move on to Champaign County in 1854. That being said, during his time in Ohio, we don't know much about his early childhood, other than the fact that in 1823, he would marry a girl, Eliza Munger, who was in the neighboring county, Montgomery County, in 1823. They would then shortly have 5 children. The first being William. I have all the dates here. I have to look at them all. It was William in 1824, John 2 years later in 1826, Wallace in 1829, the only daughter of the family, Myra, in 1834, and the last to be born, Perry Silver, in 1840. And so that's the original family homestead. When they first settled into the area, David grew up assisting his father and his siblings farming the farmland in Ohio. They would originally only have a simple log cabin. That being said, they would quickly build a fairly substantial brick home that they would live in. which you can see just in kind of nestled into those trees right underneath the portrait of David Silver. It would actually later go on to be the exact outline that they would utilize to build their permanent residence here in Champaign County. That being said, David Silver's travels are actually fairly interesting. He was a very, very wealthy dairy farmer. And so he would make weekly trips down to Cincinnati, as well as do kind of cross-country trips where he traveled throughout the Midwest for his business. And on one of those trips, in the 1850s, he traveled to Champaign County where he would discover the plains in the area of Urbana and would fall in love. And he decided that he wanted to move his family there. And so David would bring four of his children with him. He would bring Wallace, Perry, John, and Myra with him. And then a few years later, William would then come and join them. That being said, they would initially settle on a small plot of land just to the southeast of Urbana, which is about 180 acres. That being said, shortly after that, we don't know exactly when, they would buy, roughly 320 acres of additional land just to the north of Philo. That being said, the sons would begin to establish themselves as farmers as well, and so they also branched off a little bit from the family as well. Wallace and John Silver would buy land and would farm it together just catty-corner from their father's farmland just to the north of Philo. Otherwise, at the very least, things went fairly well for the family until Eliza's death, in which David would also begin to fail as well. Despite being known as a pillar of the community and a very prominent member of the community, he would start to develop cataracts and would start to go blind, and he would also ail from old age as well. And so it was decided that David wanted to return back to his childhood home in Springboro, Ohio, where he would spend the rest of his days. John and Myra joined him initially, though John would eventually come back to tend back to his farmland in Champaign County, while Myra would remain by his side until his death in 1875. Which is one of the reasons, well, at the very least, I'll get that here in just a second. So now let's go over a little bit more about the actual siblings. The only picture I don't have of any of the family members is of William Silver, unfortunately. I have at least photos or an artistic rendition of all of the other siblings. Perry, William, and Wallace all began families and, like I said, began to farm their own land. That being said, their families would kind of differ. Perry would marry Mary Heisler, and they would have a single son, Alfred Fred Silver. Perry would actually go on to serve in the Union Army, where he would contract a chronic illness that later became chronic bronchitis, and he would actually pass shortly after his return to Champaign County after the war. William would go on to marry Sarah Barnett and have 4 children, Joseph and Anna, who would remain unmarried over the course of their life, and Sarah Silver, who would marry into the Conkling family, and Myra Silver, who would marry into the Love family. Wallace would marry twice. First, he would marry Rebecca Mullen, and then would later marry Mary Carr, and would have 3 children over the course of that marriage, David, Charles, and Howard. So let's now switch focuses just really quick, and we'll talk a little bit about one of our other key components of this story, the railroad. Back in the 1850s, the railroad was becoming very influential in Champaign County, obviously as the Illinois Central began its line north and south running through the center of Champaign County. That being said, there were many other railroads that were also looking to make use of the community and to begin to make profits in the area. And so it was around that same time that the Great Western built their main line through the southern portion of the county, running through Homer, Sidney, Philo, and Tolono and Ivesdale. Their line would primarily run from their main hubs in Ohio and run all the way to St. Louis. That being said, later in 1874, about 20 years later, the Great Western would be purchased by the Wabash Railroad Company, who would utilize it to expand their main line from their main hub in Toledo, Ohio, all the way out to St. Louis as well. That being said, a little bit less than a decade after that, they would decide to hopefully service and siphon off some funds from the more wealthy community members and from the areas of Urbana and Champaign. And so they would run a secondary line from Sidney and would run it to the northwest into Urbana proper, where they would have their station in downtown Champaign. On this secondary line, there were 2 stops, Deers and Myra Station. And so now let's take a look at those farms shortly after the station's construction. As you can see, Myra Station is sat right there, which would be the intersection of Route 130 and High Cross Road. Now, right about near where the Myra Ridge subdivision would be located, just to the east of that. That being said, as you'll find, you'll see Myra Silver's land, 238 acres there. Just to the west of that, you'll find an additional 130 acres with J.L. and Myra Silver. That would be her brother John and Myra. John and Myra were never married over the course of their life, and they acted as business partners for each other, essentially. You'll also find a few other Silvers in here. You'll find a Mary Silver up here, just to the south of Urbana. And then there were more Silvers in the Philo area. Once again, if you remember where the David Silver farmland was when we looked at that map originally, that's been now split up into 3 sections. One, with Myra Silver owning about 320 acres. The southern half of the eastern section is 160 acres owned by John Silver. And then just to the north of that, you have James M. Love. That would be the James M. Love that Myra Silver, the second, would marry into and then would unfortunately pass due to childbirth. That being said, there are a few other Silvers that you'll notice here. There's an MD and W Silver here. The W Silver, that is Wallace Silver. Otherwise, down here at the very edge, somewhere in here, pretty sure I had it. Yeah, JB Silver. There it is, all the way down there in the corner. That JB Silver, that is Joseph Silver. That is William's son. That being said, things were progressing fairly smoothly for the family, even despite the passing of David, until 1903. It was during that time when, on November 20th, Myra was visiting the station to talk to the current owner of the elevator at that time and visit the office that she had there. When she left the station to board and get onto the platform to board the oncoming train headed to Sydney. And we don't know why. There are accounts in the newspaper that state that there were witnesses there that attempted to warn her from crossing the tracks. However, whether she didn't hear them or she didn't acknowledge them or ignored them, we do not know, but she stepped out into the tracks where she was struck by the incoming train, where she was killed instantly. She was 69 when she died. She was unmarried and left no living heirs, which proved to be a fair consequence for the family later on. That being said, she was interred out at Mount Hope Cemetery. You'll find that her brother, John Silver, is also interned next to her as well. He would pass later on, which we'll cover here in just a minute. That being said, the most interesting part of this case for me, honestly, was trying to uncover the story of exactly what happened involving the court cases revolving around Myra's death and her subsequent will. Essentially, what happened was on her deathbed, or when she died, she had appointed 2 executors in her will to oversee the contents, which were R.S. Wilbur and her brother John Silver. Her will was split into 2 sections. The first stipulation was that all of the land and all of her ownings were to be given to her brother John over the course of his natural life. And subsequently, upon his death, a bunch of other aspects would then become valid. Those involved giving various amounts of money to a lot of different family members. Land was to be given out to a variety of different family members, nieces and nephews. Anna and Sarah were specifically given 65 acres just off of the original David Silver family farmland. One of the most interesting ones that I found that was in the newspaper was that the Baptist Church of Urbana was to be given $300, and they were pretty darn happy about that. They posted on that in the newspaper like 3 times. That being said, including all of those other provisions, the remainder of all of Myra's estates were to be divvied out between 11 of the living family members. That being said, things did not exactly go according to plan. Over the course of the initial executorship, John actually wasn't cooperative with R.S. Wilbur from what I've been able to find, and delayed working on dividing the assets for basically the rest of his life. And this wouldn't really come to light until later after his death. And so while this entire situation is ongoing, John would continue to farm and live on the family homestead in the original David Sylvan farm, and he would become a very profitable and well-known cattle dealer. There were a couple of instances where I found that this one specifically was probably my favorite, where basically like a gentleman who oversees and rates cattle came to his farm and rated it as one of the best in Illinois. Otherwise, I also found a few sales of fairly substantial amounts of cattle while he was overseeing the farm in the 6 years that he was alive and the owner. He would pass in 1909 at the age of 83. Alfred Fred Silver, who was Perry's son, Perry's only son, would go on to buy the elevator and manage it until 1909. And there's a picture of Alfred Silver, and that's a picture of the elevator in the 1930s and 40s. I wasn't able to find a picture of the elevator beforehand but that's essentially what it would have looked like around the time that Alfred would have been managing it. And so, after John's death, this is when kinds of things hit the nail on the head. As John's executors began going through the contents of his will, they began to find some errors, essentially, where John had been keeping farmland, he had been keeping equipment, livestock, grain, basically hidden away from R.S. Wilbur, trying to keep all of that for himself, or to just keep it out of the family's hands so that they couldn't contest it when they were going through Myra's will. Why, we're not entirely sure, since the vast majority of the land was already left to John through his natural life. We're not entirely sure. It's one of the things that, unfortunately, we don't really know. That being said, essentially what happened was that after John's seat was found, the family wanted to do right by Myra and wanted to fix the situation and make sure that the money that the family owned and the land was divvied out to the family members. And so they would sue John posthumously. They'd take him to court. And that was to open Myra's will back up and to make sure that everything that was meant to be given to the family was given out properly. And so they would go through the will. R.S. Wilbur was once again brought on as executor to oversee this case. He would, I don't include it in here, but the interesting thing for me was that he would go to the court and say, okay, this is what the land is going to be, this is what the money is going to be, and the family would say no, and throw it out, and then would reject it, and then tell him to go back to the drawing board and fix it. And he'd do that like 2 or 3 times, and then he dies. And so then another gentleman is brought on to oversee the rest of the will, and he does that again. I think he does it like once or twice, and finally the family accepts it, and then finally the land is sold, which the vast majority of it is given to Alfred, and there's basically the family money is divvied out as it was meant to be divvied out. And so that was kind of the first chaos that was thrown into the Silver family. That being said, Fred would sell the elevator about a year later after the case was over. He would sell it to Henry Newton Pell, who at the very least I found in a couple of different instances referenced as H.N. Pell or just Newton Pell. And he would go about improving the facilities at the station. He introduced additional machinery, as well as renovated the offices at the station to improve the efficiency of the elevator and also to get it up to snuff. One of the other fun stories that I found during this time regarding the elevator, they got robbed in like 1913. They broke into the office of H.N. Pell and blew out the safe. But the fun thing for me was that they didn't blow it up, they used a crowbar. And the newspaper at the time basically made fun of them for not using dynamite, which was considered, I guess, to be the more efficient of the two methods of safe cracking at the time, and basically called them like hicks, would be a good way to kind of think about it. But a few years after that robbery, during World War I, H.N. Pell and another local community member in the area, Louis Prather, actually got together to form a committee of local farmers and community members living in the Myra area to start fundraising for Liberty Bonds for the war effort for World War I. And the interesting thing for this is that they raised almost $7,000 for the war effort at that time, which was more than basically every other community in the area was able to raise for the war effort. That being said, let's now jump back into the Silvers a little bit. So looking after, well, the reason why Fred sold the elevator is he had political aspirations. He wanted to get on and join the city of Urbana as the assistant supervisor, which would be the second assistant supervisor for the city of Urbana, which in and of itself was fairly controversial. The city of Champaign only had one assistant supervisor for the city, and well, they certainly wouldn't allow Urbana to get a second before they could. So citizens of Urbana actually protested and went to the city council meetings and basically told them, no way, we're not going to allow you to do that. Well, the city of Urbana pushed through, and eventually Fred would be hired on as the second assistant supervisor for the city of Urbana, joining H.C. Cunningham in 1910. The original sibling families went back to live on their farms and would continue farming the land. That being said, things would still be difficult for the Silver family. William would actually be crushed by a hay bale in 1910 while assisting his son Joe out at his farm. He would be severely injured by this accident but would not die. That being said, the Silvers would face some additional tragedies a few years later. Fred's son Ralph would be thrown off of a cedar while out in the field, where he would struck his head and eventually bled to death shortly after. Otherwise, the only thing that I've been able to find, Wallace's death seems to have been peaceful. I wasn't able to find much information about his passing, but it seems that he passed due to old age in 1914. William, unfortunately, couldn't seem to avoid fate. William would actually be killed in a car accident in Piatt County near Beeman. While he and his son Joseph were out for a drive, they would get into a car accident. Joseph would be severely injured, breaking an arm. Unfortunately, William would pass due to his injuries. That being said, I'll show you a bit more of the farm. As you can see here, A.E. Silver, that's Alfred Perry's son, who's now owning the vast majority of the family's farmland. Once again, you can see Myra Station still there. And then in the Philo area, it seems like it cut it off a little bit. But at the very least, you'll also see Wallace Silver now owns 160 acres. James still loves the 160 acres there. A&S Silver, that's Anna and Sarah. And then you'll also notice down here, there's still Joseph, somewhere on here, right there, 120 acres. Otherwise, I've got high-resolution scans of these plat maps on our website in the article. So at the very least, if you wanted to get a closer look at these and see what other local community members were farming in this area, you can do so there. That being said, there were some other interesting things that happened in the 1910s involving the elevator. The first was the first recorded car accident that would occur out on the curve at Myra Station. I'm sure many of our older community members might remember that curve that went from Windsor Road and curved to the south onto High Cross Road heading south towards Philo. The first accident that was recorded there was in 1917, involved Elmer White and Fred Porter, who, while their cars were reportedly badly damaged, how they kept remarking how the bumpers were rather dented, though both of the gentlemen only had minor injuries. That being said, probably the most interesting thing I've ever read in my life occurred shortly after, when an arrest was made just outside of Myra Station in 1919 with that Ivesdale man who was put in solitary. I imagine that it was a rather slow news day, because the author of that news story decided to write it as if he were writing about ships. And so he constantly wrote and referenced the policemen as Captain Isaac McDade and First Mate Gleason, referred to the boats as vessels or capsizing, and he would eventually, he was drunk driving on Market Street, essentially in downtown Champaign, and hit a few vehicles before driving through Urbana and making an escape to the southeast, where he would eventually drive his car into a ditch and then would be surrounded right near Myra Station, where he would be arrested and later put into solitary. One fun note just for our own reference, that's actually fairly substantial. While Prohibition wasn't active throughout the country at that point in time, both Champaign and Urbana had already said yes to Prohibition before that in 1907. And so, him both being intoxicated and driving were both substantial crimes during that time. One of the other fun things is, once again, the station was robbed just later that year. That being said, instead of mocking the would-be robbers' methods of robbing the station, they just made fun of them for robbing it because, well, why would they think there'd be money at a grain elevator when they just deal in vouchers and bonds, which was rather entertaining as well. They called them yeggs, which was interesting, which was a slang at the time, once again, for essentially like a hillbilly. That being said, unfortunately, the Silver family would once again face an additional tragedy shortly after in the 1920s. After about 14 years as assistant supervisor, Fred Silver would retire from his political position after losing an additional race for supervisor. And he decided at that point, after losing, that he would retire back to his farm and he would spend his remaining days living with his family and helping to raise their children. That being said, it was during this time that Alfred utilized his wealth and his connections to take both his family and some of his friends and local community members on vacations across the country. It was during one of these vacations, unfortunately in Monticello, Wisconsin, near the Wisconsin Dells area, that he and his daughter Ethel went on a boat ride. And as far as I've been able to tell, the story itself doesn't give us too much information, which, to be honest, if any community members does know a little bit more about the story, that would help. It seems Ethel may have fallen into the water and was unable to swim. And her father, Alfred, dove in after her, attempting to save her, and unfortunately both would drown. Their bodies would then be brought back to Champaign, where they would be buried. So, after Alfred's death, we're going to go through and take a little bit, again, a look at the silver farmland in the 1920s. Once again, you'll find that the land has once again been broken up again. Now, Harold A. Silver, who would be another one of the, I'm forgetting which one of the sons he is. I think he's another one of Alfred's sons, if I remember.
The oldest.
Yep. Yeah. And he would live there with his brother, John. And then there's Mary Silver there, as you can find. Alf E. Silver is up here as well. You'll find that the station is now technically on the property of H.N. Pell, who still is owning the station. That being said, in Philo, you'll find once again that the land has split up quite a bit again. Anna and Sarah still own their 80 acres of land. John Burr and James M. Love still own theirs. That being said, these parts of lands have now been handed over to David A. Silver, who would be one of Wallace's children, if I remember correctly.
That 160, 2 miles north of Philo there, that L shape.
Yeah.
Just that east leg of that is still owned by the 6th generation of the
Silver family?
Silvers.
That's
These guys
fantastic.
right here.
Got it. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. Otherwise, you'll still find that Joe, despite his injuries and despite his father's passing, still owns his section of land, that 120 acres, just to the southeast of Philo. That being said, in the 1930s, while it was still under H.N. Pell's management and ownership, I came across another fairly interesting, funny story that would involve the Wirtz family. So, Phi Delta Theta, while engaging in some homecoming activities, looking for firewood for a bonfire to celebrate the occasion, decided that they were going to do something rather crazy to me, and drove out into the countryside in search of firewood. Well, they would first come across the Willard School, which was principaled by a member of the Prather family, and they would break down both an outhouse and a hog pen, and would then continue on their debauchery, and would continue on into Myra Station, hoping to find more wood for their bonfire. That being said, one person they did not expect to find was a guardsman on duty, who was keeping watch over the elevator. And so, Earl T. Wirtz, watching as this was occurring, decided to put a stop to things, ordered the students to stop, and upon not stopping, fired his shotgun and struck 2 students, E.F. Haywood and Robert Strauch. E.F. Haywood would be struck in the chest and would be severely injured. Robert Strauch would be struck in the face. Both would be taken to the hospital. Both would eventually recover. The 8 others, funny enough, would be taken by H.N. Pell and E.T. Wirtz to the police station, where they would be jailed. That being said, both E.T. Wirtz and the Prathers and H.N. Pell would be called in to testify later at the students' court case.
That was my grandpa. But he wasn't charged.
No, he was not. No, they brought him to the court case not to charge him, but to testify.
Yeah.
Yep. Otherwise, there were some other fun activities going on at the station in the 1930s. This was the first instance that I was able to find of the community picnic, which was held at a local farmer that was just to the east of Myra Station at the Cecil Hudson Farm. These were very large occasions. It wasn't just local community members that would come and attend these events. It was recorded that the first day, or the first year that they had over 2,500 people in attendance. And the following year, in 1936, they would have roughly 2,000. But these were essentially a day of festivities, as you can imagine. They would have softball and hardball games. They would have picnics and food. That being said, they would also bring in different attractions to bring people together. One of the interesting things for me is that on both occasions, they brought in members of the 106th Cavalry, who would come in and basically do a riding exhibition for local community members. And it's even reported that they also had stunt shows for biplanes that would be ongoing during that event as well. But at the very least, I was only able to find instances of this event happening in 1935 and 1936. I imagine that these happened about every year. They just weren't always reported on. But at the very least, I haven't been able to find much information about either of those two. Otherwise, it was around this time, or around the end of the decade, that the Silvers would eventually return to the elevator. Harold and John Silver, who were sons of Fred, would go on to manage and own the farm, and they would go on to buy the elevator at the end of the decade. They would incorporate their business first as just Silver Brothers. And business was incredibly successful for the elevator during that time. They would hire multiple employees who would help to cover it. I remember if they would hire Kenneth Buck Silver, who's here on the left, and then Cecil Heiners, who's there in the middle, and then John Silver, just for reference, is the gentleman on the right there. That being said, once again, the elevator would face a potential tragedy once again in 1942. This tornado in March 16th of 1942 is also famous for central Illinois, as it was the last storm system that brought Illinois' last F5 to the area. That happened just to the north of Peoria in the Chillicothe area. That being said, that same storm system would later in the afternoon come through the Champaign County area, spawning an EF4 tornado in Piatt County, just to the northeast of Beaumont. It would cause extensive damage basically everywhere it went. There were multiple deaths across the local area. Storms in the entire area, this entire storm system killed more than 118 people across 6 states. That being said, in the area, 6 people were killed, 1 in Savoy, and then the rest being in Mayview. That being said, the majority of the deaths for this storm were actually in the community of Alvin, just to the north of Danville. There's still a memorial for this storm in Alvin, just across the street from their post office. That being said, amazingly so, there was no one killed at Myra Station, despite it basically almost being a head-on collision. Because just for example, it's a little hard to see here, but you've got Beaumont there, and it comes through the area, and then passes on the south side of Savoy. This is where the first casualty would occur. It was a steel beam that was ripped off of a grain bin and would strike a gentleman in the head, killing him instantly, before continuing northeast, and then Myra Station is right there. And so it passed just to the north by probably 50, 60 feet. And amazingly, there were no deaths. And the primary reason for that was, well, height advantage and the fact that it's basically flat everywhere else around, so they could see it coming with plenty of warning time. 4 of the employees dove into the grain storage bins, and 1 lowered himself down into the well, and all of them survived. Cecil Heiners actually recalled in a newspaper article in that time remembering watching a grain bin about half a mile away being torn off of its foundation and being thrown over the elevator as they watched the tornado approach. But that being said, despite that there were no casualties, it's not that the station avoided some damage. The offices that were there were completely demolished. The elevator itself had some siding just completely sheared off of it, and a fully loaded boxcar was picked up off the tracks and thrown against a pile of logs that were situated right next to the actual elevator itself. These are all taken from the Champaign County Archives. They actually have a bunch of photos of this tornado from a couple of different areas, and they also have some more photos of Myra Station's damage as well. That being said, thankfully, there were no deaths in the area. They got back to rebuilding very quickly. And at the very least, the brothers kind of took this in stride and used the opportunity to rebuild, not just back to what they were, but even better. And so they built 2 additional large elevator silos right next to the old one, which you can see the old one, smaller one right there, and then 2 additional larger elevators right next to it. In addition, they also contracted the Harshbarger Building Company in the 40s to construct 2 Quonsets that are still, well, they're not there anymore, but they were there up until the elevator's closing in 1986. That's a picture of Harold Silver inside one of those Quonsets just after their completion in the 1950s. That being said, they also did have the opportunity to expand their business, not just at the elevator, but by acquiring an additional elevator. This was when they bought the Mowing House elevator at 216 North Broadway, which would be right next to the Station Theater, which was originally the Big Four Depot in downtown Urbana. And that's when they would officially change their name to the Silver Brothers Grain and Coal Company. And that's because the Mohenkows elevator already had grain storage and some coal facilities on their grounds. And it was during this time that the elevator continued to flourish. Many local community members that I've talked to have very fond memories of the elevator during and around this time. Specifically, they'd remember their fathers coming in and waiting while their grain was being unloaded by heading out into the back of the office and playing a few rounds of cards. Or they'd remember going in and getting a candy bar or a cold soda. But it was also during that time that the brothers themselves were doing very well for themselves. That's John on the left and Harold on the right.
The guy on the far left
This one?
is Fred Wertz.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy across from him is his brother Howard.
This one right here?
Uh-huh. That's my grandpa's brothers.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, I don't know if that's a Douglas sitting against the wall, but that might be a Deere's. It
Got it.
might be a Myra.
Mm-hmm.
They frequent both places, the
Mhm.
farmers did.
Got it. Well, thank you. Yeah.
Surprise.
Go ahead, Mike.
I just have to throw this in. The big guy, he's back to the wall,
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
John Douglas.
Okay.
His son, George Douglas, went to Hollywood and was in several movies.
Oh, wow.
Get out of here. Wow.
Jet Douglas was what he went by, and he ended up as a national newscaster on the radio. I used to hear him a lot.
Do you know which station he was on? Do
Pardon?
you know which station he was on?
He was on a lot of stations. 'Cause
Okay.
it's a national network.
Got it.
So, anyway, that's John Douglas. That's his dad.
Cool.
Thank you. That being said, unfortunately, it seems that, once again, misfortune couldn't stay away from the Silver family forever. And so 2 years later, in 1952, the Silver family, Harold and John, would be embroiled in a court case with the federal government. They were contracted by the Commodity Credit Corporation, also known as CCC, to house about $300 worth of grain at Myra Station on behalf of the government. That being said, I'm not entirely sure exactly how it went down, but it seems that Harold, primarily Harold, and John in some part, sold the grain out from underneath the federal government. And so when the government came looking, well, grain wasn't there. And so they obviously were a bit upset on that, and they pursued the brothers in federal court, first forcing the brothers to put up a chattel mortgage with the business and family property as collateral, awaiting the decision by the federal government courts on exactly what the brothers would be expected to pay in compensation. That being said, the brothers, in response to this chattel mortgage, then declared bankruptcy, which, to be honest, this was probably the most confusing part of this story, is that they went in and out of bankruptcy court almost every month, with varying people taking them to court looking to basically get their money back, because they still owed a few community members for other sales of grain or other housings, or for, in J.E. Reeser's case, for construction that was done on Myra Station for roughly $23,000. And so while this entire thing was happening, the brothers were essentially delaying the case somewhat by going through these multiple bankruptcy hearings to try and basically do away with this, or to at the very least lessen the damage for the family. That being said, the federal government put a stop to that fairly quickly. After a few months of those bankruptcy hearings, they just went ahead and indicted the brothers on 10 counts, and they would essentially begin seizing the Silver properties. They would first do so by seizing the grain elevators, both in Urbana and in Myra, and would then begin by starting to seize the acreage of farmland, 2 family homes, and all of their machinery and livestock to be sold March 1st of 1953. That being said, when they had those sales, it was fairly well attended. That was when they were selling the Silver family farmland, and they had roughly 300 people come out. That being said, this entire situation essentially left the brothers with little to nothing at that point in time. That being said, they would at the very least avoid jail time, thankfully because of their cooperation with the federal government and the courts. And so they only received 2 years of probation. One thing I do want to state at the very least, It seems that, for the most part, Harold seemed to have been the primary contributor towards this. Most of the charges for John were dropped. I think he only faced 3 out of the 10, while Harold only faced about 7 out of those 10 charges. And so things changed quite a bit for the elevator after that. Essentially what occurred was, after the federal government seized the elevator, they began looking for buyers. And so 2 buyers appeared, Richard Reeser and a group of local farmers who formed the Myra Grain Company, who went back and forth, basically submitting bids at around $40,000 for the elevator and its corresponding land around the railroad. That being said, I wasn't entirely sure. In the newspaper records, essentially the federal government would just reject both bids and tell them to come back with something better, and so they would raise the bid by $500 and then basically submit it again, and they do that for 2 or 3 months. That being said, eventually Reeser's bid was finally accepted when he added the stipulation that the Federal North Iowa Grain Company, who was overseeing the elevator for the federal government during the court case, he allowed them to continue to lease the elevator for an additional 15 years. And the Broadway elevator in Urbana would eventually be sold to George W. Cook. That being said, that was very short-lived. He would sell it to Robert Reuter for less than 3 months later. I lose track of that elevator after that. That being said, an additional change also occurred about a decade later, in 1964, when the Norfolk and Western Railroad would buy the Wabash Railroad and cease all passenger travel on that route from Sydney to Urbana. And so at the very least, things began a steady decline for the elevator during this time. And so, at the very least, we get into kind of the Myra Station's final decades. In 1968, the Federal North Iowa Grain Company's lease ended, and Reeser would then lease out the elevator to B.C. Christopher Company, where David Prawl would oversee its operations as his manager. That would continue on for about 7 years, when in 1975, the Savoy Grain Company would lease the elevator, and Howard Mumm would come on as its final manager. It was also during that time, about 5 years later, beginning in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when concerns start to arose about the city's safety as well as its growth in Urbana City Council meetings and within kind of the community's atmosphere. There were a few articles that I was able to come across of community members addressing concerns that the railroad brought with freight travel coming into the heart of downtown Urbana, as well as concerns that the railroad was limiting the amount of growth that the city could have due to zoning restrictions. And so it was during this time that Elizabeth Crabtree and a few other community members actually brought this before the city council, essentially attempting to put an end to all travel on those tracks in Urbana, right in the middle of that. That being said, it wouldn't initially pass, but those concerns would continue to remain and would eventually impact the railroad and the station when in 1980, the tracks in downtown Urbana would eventually be removed. And they would eventually make plans to remove the rest of the tracks within the coming decade. That being said, that wouldn't happen initially. The elevator would still be operational for a few years until I believe it was 1983, when it would eventually close. And it would be vacant for a few years, and then eventually in July of 1986, the O'Neill's Construction Company began work to both demolish the elevator and to create a proper intersection at High Cross Road and Windsor Road. This was primarily to also assist in alleviating the number of traffic accidents that occurred on that same corner that ran from Windsor Road onto Route 130 running to the south. And so the city saw this as kind of a win-win situation for them and a lose-lose situation, unfortunately, for many community members. And now, unfortunately, only a roadside remains on near that intersection. That being said, I'll end this presentation just like I did the last. Yeah.
I noticed that the Myra sign on Windsor, the spelling now was M-I-R-A.
Yes. Yeah, and that was, I forgot to mention that in the talk. Yeah, to go back to, when the Wabash Road was coming into the area, they just misspelled it accidentally, M-I-R-A, and then everybody else just went off of what the railroad said because, well, the railroad has to be right. And so it was officially named Myra Station, though local community members basically would always correct it. That being said, the only issue with this whole thing is that Myra always spelled her name in all official documents that I've been able to find with a Y. The only document that I've been able to find where her name is officially spelled M-I-R-A is on her father's will. When he left all of the farmland to Myra, he spelled it M-I-R-A. And I don't know why. I'm not sure if it's just the fact that she might have used both spellings but preferred one, or what. It's something that I have just been unable to uncover.
My thought about that is he couldn't see by probably the time he made that will.
That's
and
true.
Somebody else was writing actual thing.
That's a good point.
But, that said, her brother Perry, in a couple of letters, well, in one letter, he actually spells Myra M-I-R-A.
Really?
And then in other letters, he spells it M-Y-R-A. So, there you go.
Yeah. Something interesting. But yeah, at the very least, even today, Myra is still spelled M-I-R-A. For example, if you go onto Google Maps and you look at Myra, it's still spelled M-I-R-A, despite the fact that it's spelled and been misspelled for like, oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, at the very least, one of the things that the Silver family was very gracious in being able to provide for me in the course of my research was a number of family reunion photographs. And so at the very least, I'm going to end the presentation today much like I did for my first one, and showing you a couple of the family reunions. And I'd just like to know if anybody can identify anyone, or if you have any questions.
Yeah, Daryl and I have been trying to figure this out for the last few years. I know some of the people in it.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and especially on the right side.
From the 1940 reunion?
Yeah, but also on the left, down on the ground, you see that daughter, the girl on her knees, that's my mother. Next to her is Don Silver. That's another child of Alfred. And then next to him, is that Buck?
Right there?
That might be Buck, yeah.
That'd be Kenneth,
Ken.
who would be an employee of the elevator later on.
Some of the others, the gentleman in the center, I think he's got a bow tie.
Yeah,
That's Joe Silver.
that would be William's son.
Yeah, and then to his left, or our right, I think that's Anna Silver. His left.
Oh, his left.
Yeah,
That one.
I think that's Anna Silver.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right above her is Frank Wells. Right above her, is back row, third from the right,
yeah,
is Frank Wells.
Mm-hmm. Got it. You're welcome to come up and get a close look if you'd like.
There's a Miller in there too, to the far right, I think. And Wally said he was in that. No, he's not in there. But he's in this one.
Yeah,
Yeah. Which one?
the middle row, all the way to the right, was my grandfather Frank. My dad's in candy corn in front of him, and Wally's sitting.
With his knees pulled up there.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
With
Wally's
his
sitting.
arms crossed there?
No, second kid from the right in the front row.
Yeah.
His knees pulled up to his chest.
And Wally's sitting next to him, and Wally just passed away this winter.
Wally was here at the first one.
In October, yeah.
So he was probably the last one,
And
one in that picture.
there's several in the back row I know. My dad and mom are there, my grandparents, Buck is there. There's some others. But, Don and Louise, his wife, Don Silver. Yeah, I think that's where I got them. Years ago.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So, I'm not from Illinois, but I've lived in the area for St. Joseph for a long time.
Okay.
So I get confused as to where the elevators were. The little house that is being remodeled on Windsor and 130.
Oh,
Yes.
Okay, where are the elevators?
be corresponding to that.
Yes.
It would have been on the southwest side of that intersection. I've got a picture of it. If you go out to that intersection, you will still see the imprint of where that large curve went from Windsor to Route 130. And the elevator sat nestled kind of right just to the northeast of that corner. And so it would,
Catty corner.
yeah, it's essentially right there.
So it's the southwest corner
hmm
is where those elevators were.
Yep.
Yes.
hmm
When did the elevators come down then?
The elevator was torn down in 1986. Yeah, so it's been, what, gosh, 34 years since, yeah, 38.
A man that worked for my dad was out there one day,
hmm
and anyway, an oil can landed at his feet, and he looked up, it was my brother John going across the catwalk. Catwalk didn't have sides on or anything.
Oh, gosh.
I can't imagine the terror in my father's, heart over that.
Uh-huh.
They got him down all right. He loved to climb. I do too.
Yeah,
I got a question or two about pertaining to the railroad aspect of this.
sure.
So there was a passenger train that went from Urbana to Sydney or vice
Mhm.
versa, right?
Yeah, at the
Did it-
height,
Did it stop at Myra?
yes, yes, it
So there
did.
was actually a station
Mhm.
where a person could board the
Yeah,
train?
and it's why in the plat maps you don't see it referenced as an elevator. It's referred to as Myra STA for Myra Station.
Okay.
The thing is that the station was just a platform. It was not like you would stop there and there'd be a whole depot and you'd buy tickets and rest there. It was essentially like a concrete pad with
You
like
could
a
get
small
off the train
overhang.
there.
Yep, you could get off there
And
too.
then did freight trains stop there and get grain
Mhm.
from the elevators?
Yep.
And then just strikes me as something similar, and maybe you don't think about this, rising,
hmm
is that something similar?
Yeah,
Because
it's.
it looks like there's a railroad stop there as well.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a very common situation for a lot of those unincorporated communities. They were stops on the railroad that were grain elevators that were usually named for a local family, and they existed when the railroad did, but when the railroad went away, well, the elevators had no purpose at that point, and so they would just tear them down. And so, at the very least, the communities might still remain, much like how Myra does. It's just, it doesn't have its community hub that it used to. Yeah, go on, Mike.
The railroad for passengers was called the interurban,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's probably a common, it was a way for people that lived in these small towns, just like a subway in a big city. The interurban out here on the prairies did the same thing. Enabled people to get to the bigger community.
You're thinking of the traction system, correct? The Illinois traction system?
The tracks, yeah.
Yeah. It did not get down into that area. They had an actual steam locomotives that would provide transport on that route. The traction system only ran east-west for the most part in the CU area. It got out to Homer. It went through like St. Joseph. I don't believe it went down to Sydney though.
I think it did, because my granddad talked about riding on it.
Okay. I'd have to look at maps.
He talked about, they'd have to pay something to
Mhm.
get on it, but sometimes the conductor would let them go for free.
Okay. Yeah.
I know the interurban went from a branch from the east-west line between Danville and Urbana,
hmm
and Sydney went absolutely south to Homer Park, a recreation
Okay.
area. It did not
Got it.
go to Sydney.
Okay.
No electric line went to Sydney.
Got it. Okay. Go ahead.
Let him go first.
Okay.
Did you have anything about Silver School, how it came to be? Did they
Yeah.
donate the land or something?
So that's actually a fairly interesting story, which let me actually, well, you can actually see it in this plat map very well. The Silver School that I'm sure probably a lot of you are remembering is actually a different school than the one that I initially was thinking of. Because the original Silver School is actually just to the north of the original family homestead, which is like essentially like right here. It's now like I think a duplex
Yes.
that's now a home. The original Silver School that I started looking at actually goes back to like some of the first plat maps of the area that I was able to find. It is actually right on the edge of the Silver family property line. And this one I've been able to find was a one-room schoolhouse that was operational for a period of time, but I've been unable to find that much information about that specific iteration.
There was a Yankee Ridge School,
Mm-hmm.
which was also on the edge of the Silver Property.
That might be the one that I was looking at.
It was originally on the Yankee Ridge, Glacial Moraine, and they moved
Mhm.
it catty corner a mile So it, when it was burned down, tore down, it was, a mile off of Philo Road.
I've got it at home.
Let's see,
2 miles north of
where
Philo.
the, DA Silver, the L-shaped,
Yeah, on here.
okay, so if you go to the end of that road,
To the
that,
left,
to the left,
To the left.
that little dark mark.
yeah, that
That's
was, Yankee Ridge.
Got it.
Yeah,
But yeah, at the very least.
Still there.
there was a lot of those schoolhouses out there.
Yep, and this is the one that I've been kind of the most interested about, because you can find information about that silver school that's now a duplex. It did burn at one point in time, fairly recently, within the last like 20 years.
Well, I was talking about my brother
Mhm.
crawling across that catwalk.
Yeah.
We just buried him last Saturday.
Oh gosh.
Out at,
Well, my condolences.
Woodlawn. And anyway, I was telling a story about the oil can, and the
Mhm.
minister was somebody we knew, family, you know. We weren't family, but we knew him.
Mhm.
And he said, well, maybe he'll send a sign, you know, to you. And there, we looked up and there was a deer coming across. I thought, that's the oil can.
I got pictures of that school, of classes in that school. My mom and
Mhm.
Huck and Harold Jr. all went to that school. The old
Brick
brick,
place?
One
brick
room?
house, the brick,
Oh, the brick
the brick
house.
school.
Mhm.
Still a residence, still there.
Yep.
But it's not close to the main house.
It's no, yeah, it's like where he was pointing up on the map there.
Mhm.
The
Yeah.
one out on the highway, the newer one.
Yep.
That wasn't open very long, I don't think.
Mhm.
They closed that.
Everybody went to Yankee Ridge and
That land for that school.
I went to this, the one you're talking about, the duplex.
Yeah.
In first grade, and when I tell this story, my friends laugh at me and my grandkids. It was a 2-room schoolhouse. And when you walked in the door, there was first and second that Miss House taught. Then my Aunt Arlene Willard was the principal and taught 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. I don't know how she had so many.
Yeah.
But there was just the 2 rooms, boys and girls bathroom, a coat room. Downstairs was a cafeteria that Miss Kelly cooked all of our meals. They're delicious. And that was it. It was just this little tiny school, and it just didn't dawn on me till I came to town in 2nd grade. And even though it was Wiley, which is not a big school, I was terrified at all the rooms and the halls and everything. But it was a neat way to get introduced to the school system.
Diane, do you remember, who was your teacher?
Miss House,
Is your name Asa?
Atha House.
There was a lady married to my grandmother's brother, Charlie Willard.
Arlene.
Arlene. That was
That's my
Arlene.
aunt.
She taught in the old school, the new one, and
Yankee
that was
Ridge.
it. Huh?
I think she went up to Yankee Ridge.
Yeah, maybe.
Right, yeah. She was the principal when I was there.
Yeah.
I
Yeah, go
often
ahead.
wish that I'd been there to see all that, but there was just too much tragedy for me.
Mhm.
My nephew was racing motorcycles one time.
Oh,
Oh
yeah.
gosh.
Champagne.
Mhm.
And my dad told him, he said, Scott, I wish you quit that, there's been too many deaths in the family. And he did quit.
Mhm. Well, are there any other questions? If not, thank you so much for coming, everyone. And at the very least, we do these history talks every month. The next one is going to be on July 18th, if I can remember my dates correctly. We have Ryan Ross from the Alumni Association at the University of Illinois, who's going to be exploring the history of homecoming on campus. But otherwise, at the very least, thank you all for coming. If you do have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me.
Tornado that went through.
Thank you.
Tore down my house.